Hi, welcome to Growing the Edge, the show about transformation. So this week we're going to talk about transformational archetypes. And I'm joined by Petra, Tom, Tim, Susan and Christina. Christina is the only one amongst us who actually has archetype in her title on her LinkedIn page. So she's obviously most qualified to actually take us through what an archetype actually is. It's a term that's fairly new to me. I have to say, in the last couple of years. But so Christina, what is an archetype essentially?
Yeah, I mean, we can view archetypes at so many through many dimensions, through many different levels, and that's why they actually are archetypes. But to me, they're really just a symbolic language of the universe, and they're really a map to help us read life. So they're said to be psychic power patterns dwelling in the deeper layers of the unconscious. But for me, personally, my own personal experience, I think that's really the only authority from which you can speak of. I do experience them as a system of living consciousness. So these universal power patterns of power drive us. And I don't mean in the old notion of how we use power over or power with, but in the sense of power as almost in the sense of being almost in a divine grace way. So these patterns become verbs and not nouns, which penetrate and influence the quality of our lives. And what archetypes do is that they actually enable us to access deeper levels of insight, wisdom, and creative energy that exist beyond the limits of the rational linear mind. And as Carl Jung said, all the most powerful ideas in history go back to archetypes. But look, let's keep it really, really simple, and let's just work with the definition that archetypes are patterns. Yeah, so just archetype patterns. We'll stick with that. So being lost in the forest is an archetype. It's a pattern as much as the ritual of marriage. Right. So there's so many universal patterns of the human psyche. So there's patterns of instinct, there's patterns of impulse, patterns of survival, patterns of faith, destiny, and soul. So archetypes don't just structure behavior, they also influence our imagination, our perception, the ideas and the choices that come to us. So it's not really about saying that these universal patterns and experiences define us, but rather they reveal us. Right. And before we open the floor, I just want to mention 3 aspects of our archetypes, just so that we've all got a common definition and we're all on the same page. So firstly, they're neutral. They have both a light and a shadow quality. So they can be as creative as much as they are destructive. There is both a grace and a challenge within the pattern. But if you look at, say, the archetype of the mother, she can obviously be expressed as the good mother, as much as it can be the devouring mother. And they are the tension of a perfect equilibrium. So put simply, what I'm trying to say, it's about archetypes are all about the imperative for wholeness, which is preferable to one-sided perfection, the condition of only being good, to only exist in the light, which is our highlight reels on social media, right? And Carl Jung again said, you can either be good or whole, but not both. Right. And that's what my work is on, that both. Also, I just really want to make this clear that when I use the term shadow in regards to archetypes, it's not about what is dark, what is bad, what is wrong, what is negative. I'm not meaning to imply any of that at all. But it refers to all that is unknown or yet to be known in you. Because it's often the unknown parts of ourselves that cause us the most chaos in our lives. Well, certainly my life, I can speak personally for that. So when we unmask the shadow aspects of ourselves, we can then harness that power consciously. Secondly, archetypes aren't literal. They're symbolic and metaphorical. And why we struggle so much with them in society is we've lost almost our, not just the archetypal eye, but a mythic and a poetic imagination and a symbolic intelligence. So to make meaning, we actually can't enter through logic. We must go through symbols. So it's through entering the symbolic realm that we gain access to the power of archetypes. And just finally, thirdly, it's while these archetypes, they're ancient, they're impersonal, they're universal. I often, when I speak, refer a lot to the Odyssey or some of the Greek pantheon. And we might think that's very far away from time that is kind of now. But as we all know in fairy tales, whenever we say once upon a time, we actually really mean now. And I love this description of myths, which is they never are, they never were, but always are. Never was, but always is. Like this, the eternal now that's kind of within them. So they become personalized when our individual psyche engages them. So it's really important to be able to look at them impersonally, because it's not that you say, I am a perfectionist, but the pattern of perfection is active in me. I'm not a saboteur, but I'm currently engaging the pattern of sabotage. So you might be struggling, like all of us, to place a value on your worth or give your soul currency, but so does everyone with the prostitute archetype, right? So this work is really not about energizing duality. So we're always in the spectrum of our esteem system. So we're not always solar. Yeah, this is what we see a lot in the world. We always want to be in the solar, but it's actually, life is within the synthesis of the inner and outer worlds. And just really a final common point, it's just, if we look at, say, the goddess Persephone, she is both life's daughter and death's bride. The god Apollo is sunshine and clarity, as much as like he's dark and wrathful. So we ventilate our psyche by allowing all parts to be. And in that way, we can approach healing and metamorphosis from a more alchemical and mystical perspective. And yeah, just to open it up on the floor, love to hear from other panelists, but to anyone that's listening out there at the moment, we're not alone. We share the common experiences of being a human being, and we'll never be more powerful than a pattern unless we realize why our psyche recruited it. And so I'll open that up to some comments.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, the thing that struck me is that you were really talking about things that obviously they're common. It's as you say, it's a common language. You know, we were talking about stories, and then some of these patterns, some of these archetypes were a bit like people with personalities, and rather like any type of personality, as you said, there's like positive and negative aspects, and I think that's really, really interesting, because I think when you were talking about the sun, are you talking about we might dwell on the positive too much rather than understanding the negative aspects?
Yeah, it's very much live your best life, like be the best version of yourself.
Yeah.
But what if you're currently in your worst version? Where do you move to actually there?
So this actually reminds me of a conversation that Nims and John Albrecht had a few weeks ago, where they're talking about if our needs are met, then our positive attributes come out, and if our needs aren't met, then our negative attributes come out. But they come from the same thing. They come from the same pattern or archetype in a sense. So I really like that duality aspect. Any other points from anybody on that?
I suppose I'd like to oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I suppose a reflection on Christina's introduction is that archetypes are giving us a powerful way of communicating with other human beings. So in the context of transformation, if we make better use of archetypes in our communications, we're more likely to engage the whole of the people that we're communicating with, because when we speak using the patterns of archetypes, we're going to engage something that's implicitly understood by other people, and the stories we tell are going to be more powerful when we engage with other archetypes that are already in people's minds, perhaps in their subconscious, but it's using archetypes in transformation can really make the transformation much more effective. And that's just I suppose a reflection on what you were saying in this particular context.
So I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Robert Keegan, and his book, and everybody culture. I think he talks about that people spend half their time at work keeping up appearances. So in your work and working with this, I'm very curious to hear how you help people use architects to navigate that side. I'm kind of feeling that it has something to do with how people create their identities, and this actually kind of breaks free maybe of the identity that they're putting forth into the world or into their organization. Is
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the awareness, but there is the higher part of I'm not my body, I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my feelings. But there is also the thing about archetypes, it's what's in your blood, right? So you can sometimes go to someone's house and there'll always be a spread because archetypally they're a host. That archetype, they cannot not but put food out. And so it's the same with someone that has the archetype of the actor. It doesn't actually mean you have to be Julia Roberts or Brad Pitt. It could be being the drama teacher, but it's what you cannot not do. But so many people at work go against their archetypes.
Or now, how does the environment drive the archetype? Do you get into how people's archetypes change depending on the environment they're in?
Oh, absolutely. There's archetypes of survival. Like a single mom has to become a warrior. That might not be her natural pattern, but it became an archetype of fate for her. Yes. And I think there's also, again, archetypes of destiny, which we will grow into. And then there are the patterns that have been with us since we were born.
Yeah, beautiful.
I just wanted to say that this, of like what you mentioned, Christina, is like being both in the archetypes. This actually also reminds me of the psychotherapy approach, and Tim might be aware of this, of the internal family systems psychotherapy approach, where we're all kind of formed of parts, and then all these parts represent actually parts of us, and they all have a role, and they all kind of have their influence on what we have. So it's actually very interesting how this actually very much links to this approach, and yeah.
Tom,
actually, I was going to ask Petra a question which I know the answer to, but just to introduce Petra to the people listening. So Petra, can you tell us a little bit about, I suppose, how archetypes may have affected you in your career choices? First of all, to train as a medical doctor, and then to move into cybersecurity. Do you feel that you had some archetypes that were influencing you behind the scenes?
Well, I definitely had to go through a transformation. Maybe that can link to like an archetype of, which is quite common in mythology as well, where, you have a person which is one thing, and then they have to, go over a challenge and transform themselves and go outside their comfort zone and become something else. So I was a medical doctor, and I decided to go and do cybersecurity. So it was a complete change of my career, it was a complete step outside my comfort zone. But at the same time, I was feeling like I wasn't completely stepping out of my, my role there, because I still felt like I had a lot of transferable skills, like I could provide situational awareness, context into cybersecurity. There was a lot of soft skills that I could use to actually bring benefits to the cybersecurity profession. So even though many people see it as a huge transformation, I feel like I still kind of kept within the role, because I'm still here to provide situational awareness. I'm still here to provide the context. I'm still here to, now software, computer programs are my patients. The vulnerabilities are my illnesses. The patches are the medication that I give. So I feel like there's still parallels here. So yeah, that's maybe how my whole story can be linked to this.
And do you feel the continuity, Petra, just to finish this off, do you think the continuity is a bit like being a traveller, because you've always felt that you were journeying through life, and these were just parts of your journey? Do you feel like you're in a traveller pattern?
Yeah, definitely. And one big thing that I've learned through this is that the journey is what matters more than the destination itself. So I think that sounds quite, something that many people say, but I think you can't accentuate enough the importance of it.
Thank you. Sorry, now Tom, maybe.
Yeah, one thing I would like to pick up, there's two things really. One is from Petra, what you just said about taking a pattern from one place and moving it in another. And that we've got the mismatch of the pattern is giving us as much as the match of the pattern. So, for example, describing your programs as, or your applications as patients is a really good example to me of using an archetype, because it's the misfit that brings up most of these ones. The other one from Christina would be the distinction, I think, between stereotype and archetype. Stereotype tends to be this very flat thing, whereas an archetype is much richer. Literally, the word means archon, is ruler, and it's got that layering to it. But this, being able to use a toolkit of archetypes and being able to understand how I can use these bits out of an archetype, like Petra has done very clearly there. I'm thinking of another one of a colleague who was a nurse who was a registered nurse who became an architect for the design of hospitals, because she had literally transferable experience into a quite different domain. I'm one who's careered. I think I said in our discussion before, I've not so much had a career as I've careered. I'm trying to think, it's at least 20 different industries. And I'm constantly using experiences from one industry in another, using a pattern as the bridge. But the crucial thing about a pattern is that it's not a fixed role. It's just a pattern. And it's the filling in the gaps and adapting the pattern to the context and knowing how to switch between them. Those are the things that I particularly look for with archetypes, particularly archetype sets. When we have a set of archetypes, like you said, the transactional analysis family set, and the Jungian ones, which I reframe slightly differently, but they're basically the Jungian set. These are sets that we look, and we're looking at the interactions between them and how we move between them. Those are the things I would add.
So they can almost be like characters on a game board or in a play, can't they? And then like any good play, we might need different types of ingredients to make it work. So there's one particular, just in terms of people I know on LinkedIn, there's somebody called Dr. Magnus Reitner who works or has worked for BMW and is helping them with agile transformation and other things. And he describes himself, I think, as a corporate jester. And I'd never really come across somebody describing themselves as a jester on LinkedIn, so I thought that was kind of cool. And I sort of went with it. And I think, Tim, you and I had some conversations about jestership in transformation,
yes,
didn't we? And I think the jester is kind of interesting because the jester is about being a figure of fun, but speaking truth to power.
Absolutely. I think there's an element of sort of edutainment that, to be effective as an outside observer, whether you're a consultant or any kind of facilitator role, counselor, you have to be able to look at the situation and express the situation in a way that's palatable and accessible to your clients and to the people who need your help. And I think when you use archetypes, one of my great influences, the late Gerald M. Weinberg, he would often use parables in Secrets of Successful Consulting. I love one of his ones was the law of strawberry jam, which was that if you're a consultant, you need to think of yourself a little like the strawberry jam, the lumpy type of strawberry jam, and when you create content that could be spread out on toast quite thinly and it's syndicated everywhere and everyone likes the strawberry jam and they want to find out more about this strawberry jam, but the best must be saved for in-person delivery because you are the lumpy bit. You are the lumpy bit, and the law of strawberry jam applies. So in-person delivery is where we deliver our best jester performances.
Yeah, and jesters, I suppose, that to work they have to be unthreatening. They have to be able to, I suppose, mix things up a bit, but in a way that doesn't directly threaten the powers. Because you
comprehend the power dynamics, comprehend the the passage of time, and you talked about the Chris, about the Janus pattern, Janus, the God looking backwards, looking forward, and being in that liminal space, and effectively is that, and again talking to Petra about awareness, that the jester has to be aware of all of these celestial bodies kind of moving around and these different dynamics, and they need to reflect that and let other people know that they understand, but they're not necessarily challenging it, they're just letting other people know what these dynamics are, because a lot of other people lack the awareness. They don't, until they're given the archetypes, until they're given the models, they're not even aware that these dynamics exist. They may not even be thinking about the past, the present, the future, the relationships, but the jester can bring to bear an awareness of the situation and bring other people into a discussion about the situation.
Yeah, I was just going to comment about another thing we brought up in our discussion before was the role of the jester is like the crank. We have to be an eccentric, literally off the center, in order to have the leverage to create a change. And so that's one of the things. That's one form of movement that we have. We sit outside, but we're literally not at the center of power, the point where the actual rotation occurs. So that's a trade-off we need to look at. And again, with a lot of archetypes, we're looking for these trade-offs about which one is appropriate. It's when we don't have choice, when, as Christina was saying earlier on, where we're not that we are an archetype, but we wear one, we choose one. I think that would be correct, Christina?
Yes, and sometimes they are chosen for us.
Yeah, well, the point is that if we lose the choice, we're stuck.
Yeah. You can see it in some children where parents will say, like, they were always an artist. They were always an athlete from the womb, something like that. The musician was already active and alive with them. So, but I think the goal in life is for us to develop those that might almost, in a way, rub and cause friction to become the pearl. And I work a lot with the Carolyn Mace model in corporates, and that's the survival archetypes. So the child, the victim, the saboteur, and the prostitute. Now, I don't mean the person on the street corner. I mean how you sell yourself for safety, security, and survival in the physical world. Those are the four legs of the table. They're not the glamorous ones. They're not your magician. They're not your alchemist. They're not your, right? But those are the ones that in a workplace environment and when transformation is required, those are the ones that are going to butt up and hit the wall.
So you brought up a interesting dynamic that, in terms of power, because that's something that we're seeing such a shift in power, primarily because things are becoming more transparent. So the more things become transparent, then the more power is threatened. And so to be, I tend to be less politically correct because mainly, I say this in a jester way, but I pretty much became an entrepreneur and have been one for 40 years. So I never got conditioned to the corporate way of playing those games. And at the same time, I was the president of my company. So, but what was fascinating when I look back on it is because I did not realize the effect and the games people were playing to keep information from me. So I mean, that is something that I find intriguing in terms of being able to play with these archetypes in a way that does make it less threatening for people to acknowledge our dark sides, and the fact that environments, oftentimes, to your point, it puts us in a survival mode, whether we want to be there or not. And so when I hear the different points of view, it especially in the political discourse in the U.S. particularly, we're not limited here, but But the fact that people are not really, they're not really understanding the power dynamics of governance, for example. And so we automatically go to that, the role or the person, and become suspect. So is that something that you guys have dealt with and maybe have used different ways of using archetypes as a tool? I know, Tom, you've done a fantastic job in SIPR in that.
Yeah. Well, I think one way I'd respond to that is that the definition I use of power is the physics one, which is power is the ability to do work. For a human context, I'd add on to that there's really important stuff around choice and so on. Otherwise, we end up with Arbeit macht frei, the work makes slavery. But if you contrast that with most common social definitions of power, which is power is the ability to avoid work. And therefore, we have this lovely clash where the more powerful people are, the less work actually gets done. And everyone wants to be in a position where everyone else is doing the work. Whereas actually, when we look at it from an archetypal perspective or a human perspective, the actual value and sense of it comes from doing the work, which is what we're doing now. In this case, the work is exploring ideas or exploring experiences. But that trade-off between power as the ability to do the work versus power as the ability to avoid work, therein lie very large numbers of our problems. And it's one of the reasons why I talked about archetypes versus archetype sets versus choosing a whole choosing between sets to do a particular job. As consultants, for example, we have to go in and wear different masks, and there's a lot in the impro space about masks, which is an archetype also plays that role as well. So Petra, I think you've got experience on that, about switching between the masks that you wear in the work.
Yeah, I do. Not just Matt, but like we call it hats in medicine as well.
Yeah.
Even in medicine, we tend to say, okay, now I'm going to put my internal medicine hat and I'm going to say this, but then now I'm going to put my surgical hat on and I'm going to say something different. And even in the same field, sometimes we do put the same hats in. But even in like cybersecurity, there's hats like or masks where you have like the black hat, of the illegal hacker, and you have the white hat hacker, and you have the gray hat hacker who's in between, who's both. Like in Christina's saying, like the archetypes can be both evil and good at the same time. So yeah, definitely that's quite a common pattern that you can see the switching of the masks, not just in like between these disciplines, but also in one discipline you have several masks that you put on, depending on the function that you need to perform in that given moment.
So I'm just going to just scan the comments. There's a few here. So Thiago said something a little bit of a while ago. So it's for you, Petra, and it's from something you said a while back. So I'm sorry, Thiago, I was a bit late on that one. So Thiago says, interesting, Petra. Did others and knowing their interfaces, what to expect from them, made smoothen that transformation? If yes, how do you take advantage of that? So I guess it's to do with your comment about treating people like patients.
Sorry, can you rephrase that?
Yeah, so it's talking about how did you take advantage? How did you, just a bit more detail in terms of how did you take advantage of seeing people as patients in your new role?
Oh, you mean like programs, applications as patients? Yeah. Well, I've just basically, it was kind of like a subconscious decision to, maybe because subconsciously as well, being a doctor, a lot of it comes from trying to protect, right? So actually my new cybersecurity role, I'm also in the function of a protector. So I'm trying to protect my systems. I'm trying to protect my computer programs from being hacked. So it was more kind of a subconscious decision where, I'm going to protect this. And in a way to protect, I need to find the weaknesses, because, the weaknesses is what can be, in the security, in information security, the weaknesses would be the vulnerabilities. And that's something that would allow exploitation of it, that would allow the threat vector to attack an application. Whereas similar in medicine, you have a threat vector, which can be a virus like COVID, and a weakness can be like an immunocompromise. So I think it was more subconsciously that I just, I had kind of this protective attitude anyway, and I wanted to get into the cyber world, into the IT world. So it was only kind of that, instinctive of me to go into that field where I would protect the computer programs, I would protect the computers from intrusion by actually finding their vulnerabilities and patching them, giving them medication or patches. It's even the same word, patch. I can patch a wound, or I can patch a vulnerability. So it was almost instinctive the way I kind of approached it, rather than.
If I can just chip in here a little bit. I can really relate to this. I'm in the cyberspace too myself, but I suppose taking a really big picture about this caring and protecting motivation in society, we can really trace it back to families and to different stages of life, because when you're young and when you're a baby, you can't look after yourself. And again, when you get into your old age, you're infirm and you need caring for. And almost like the parts, if you have a good upbringing where you have role models of parents who show you what a resilient adult can be like, and how they can protect you and they can protect the elderly people. When you have these role models, they become embedded into you. And then as you grow older, you think, I want to take on these responsibilities. I want to be an adult. I want to play my part in protecting and caring. And I think the motivation for doing that is there in medicine. It's there in cybersecurity. But there also needs to be an awareness that sometimes when you take on caring responsibilities, that can be risky, but to yourself, because if there's so much work to do, whether it's in medicine, it's almost unlimited scope of work needing to be done. With cybersecurity, it's almost unlimited work. So where is the rest and where's the self-care? So I think that's something that society needs as a whole, is to really understand the depth of what it is to be a carer, to be a key worker, and how the rest of society needs to support the key workers, the people shouldering the responsibilities and sharing these caring responsibilities. So I just wanted to chip in there and sort of just maybe explain the wider relevance of some of these things to people in other professions.
So this reminds me a little bit of, so back in the 90s, I played for a while slightly embarrassingly enough, I played in a punk band. I was like a bass player, and I was into funk, so I wasn't really. I got the F mixed for the P, so it's like I was into in this punk band in Sheffield for about 18 months, and had lots of bizarre experiences, including the gig where it was only our girlfriends, but basically the drummer Colin was an interesting character. So there's quite a lot of tie-ins here. But one thing is there are lots of stories about Colin. Colin was a mechanic, and he used to be upset if the car didn't work. He empathized for the car. So he was like a carer. He would be unhappy, and then he would make the car work, and he would be happy again. So maybe that's the thing, that he was using that kind of archetype of the carer, but applied, rather like you, Petra, to like a technical realm rather than with people directly.
It's something Tim had said that I wanted to kind of expand on. The other side of the caring that goes on in organizations is when you in essence, someone takes away somebody else's resilience by protecting them. In fact, when you were Peter, when you were talking about protecting, and quite frankly, I thought you were talking about protecting them for the medical system when you talked about the disease. Yeah, Christina, would there be a way that we could look at that situation, this scenario where, and I'll give you a prime example and a real pet peeve of mine is the whole performance review process is dysfunctional. I mean, it actually does tremendous amounts of harm in conversations with many HR people and in OD. It's like they know this, but it's like they don't know how to stop. And so how would you use that? How could we kind of play with these archetypes in that particular scenario to get people to recognize when they're over helping? And another prime example is when I worked with a leadership team and when somebody has a need to be liked, and or to be a part of the team, and yet they're a part of the leadership team and they don't really realize it because they're blind to it, right? And I think the same thing is true with your people who are over caring for others. So, I mean, am I making myself clear in terms of why?
And an example like that, you always have to go back to the survival ones for me. So many people, when I work with people in a recruitment position, I don't mean never hire, but I say that as almost this blanket statement, but never hire someone that has the orphan child archetype, because that will place a surrogate family system onto their boss or onto their team. And so when you say something that might be critical, it either triggered something that was critical in the early family structure, or it almost in one sense, it goes back to that parent-child dynamic. And there's no sense of working for this externalized other. It all becomes, this is all about me. So if I'm ostracized at work, or bullied or shunned, it's almost like I'm ostracized from the whole of life, and then taking that pattern out. I'm sure the others can speak more to this on that, but obviously the prostitute has to come up because performance reviews are linked with money. So we're not, the whole about the prostitute is basically, can I walk my talk? But actually, if there's a bonus on the other end, how much of your creative integrity can you withhold? And we see that a lot, where people will not follow their intuition for the sake of the safety of a salaried job. They don't go like you and become an entrepreneur. And then obviously the saboteur always kind of, if I said to you, I'm going to go for a jog tomorrow, I can guarantee you there'll be a thunderstorm. If I said I'm not going to eat chocolate, someone's going to bring me a chocolate cake. It's like a red flag to a bull, right? So it's almost like you have to have a little post-it note here that says like, saboteur, I've been expecting you. But in a corporate environment like that, we always think everyone else is sabotaging us, but we never actually look at how we're sabotaging others, because in a way we're being brought up to not actually applaud the person crossing the finishing line in front of us. We haven't yet got to the mystical perspective of what is in the one is in the whole. All of life breathes together. So rather than the origin of the word competitor, conspire is to conspire together, to make ourselves greater. Or very in the Buddhist, it's like we bow down to the enemy. We don't yet have that in the corporate world. And then obviously the victim, we feel obviously victimized by when we're judged. And obviously that, again, sometimes even on our best days, we can't even be our worst self, let alone when someone's reviewing the performance. I'm sure the others have much more expert opinion than I on this.
I'll just throw one thing in. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm just going to comment quickly about what Susan was saying about the reviewer, the performance review. And I often see that as someone being stuck in an archetype. I am the one who is reviewing. And again, from what Christina just said, is about the safety issue. One thing I used to notice, particularly in the BMJ, British Medical Journal, was the number of times where there's a whole section in there about doctors experiencing what it was like to be a patient. And their perspective changed spectacularly when they realized what it was like to be on the receiving end of what had been their own behaviors. And Petra, you can probably comment on this as well, that that whole shift in perspective, when you put yourself in a different archetype in relation to the archetype that you've been running. So when reviewers are reviewed, it gets to be interesting. It's when the hatchet man whose job it is to cut your job off is themselves cut. They start complaining loudly. And we see a lot of this in politics, where people who are essentially the parasites suddenly find themselves being parasited. There's screams of complaint. So this switching of archetypes about using it deliberately and consciously rather than having it dumped on you is a rather important one to do. Patrick, could you comment on that one perhaps?
Yeah, I was just about to say, it's very interesting that you say, because a lot of times this role can twist also from the protector, or we talked about, into the sabotager, like Christina mentioned, because basically we have in cybersecurity, for example, you can be the protector and protect your applications, but at the same time you can, the development team can see you as a sabotager, and if you insist too much, if you push too much without proper triage, then you can end up sabotaging the product instead of actually protecting it. And the same can be as a doctor as well. Like if you go aggressively with an operation that might not be necessary on a patient, you can actually sabotage the patient instead of protecting it. So it's just a fine line where, from a protector, you're going to turn into a sabotager. And it's also similar, like you said, Tom, about the doctor being a patient. It's very interesting how the whole perspective changes. Because but they all do say, doctors are the worst patients as well. So that kind of all fits in what you said.
Yeah. So Tim, when we were talking the other night, you gave a procurement example that was involving archetypes.
Yeah. So that was really about the, I suppose, at a very macro level, how governments approach procurement and whether they. And in fact, let's just look at the US for the sake, and I know we've got Susan here, and she'll be aware of this perspective. A lot of US government procurement is done on a cost plus basis, and the idea there is that the US government is the largest customer in the world, and the largest customer in the world can't be matched by any of its suppliers. So why wouldn't the largest customer in the world act like a grown-up and take all the risk and basically tell all of its suppliers, we don't want you to have all your little risk buffers and sort of pad for risk, because we're the grown-ups. We can handle the risk. We can have one big risk buffer, and on the same basis as the way insurance companies work, that one big risk buffer can be more efficient than lots of little small risk buffers held by all of the suppliers. So you get this in most federal procurement, but it leads to a certain behavior where all the suppliers effectively behave like children spending pocket money. So the parents giving them pocket money, they're thinking of things to spend it on, and they're running out of money and going back to the parents and asking for more. And this leads to a certain dynamic where the suppliers are never going to take real responsibility because they're not spending their own money. They're spending somebody else's money all the time. Now you move over to Europe, particularly England, where the government as a customer isn't bigger than a lot of its suppliers. You've got major multinational companies selling technology, and they are deemed to be bigger than the customer. So the customer and the people doing procurement, they've probably been well educated, gone to good universities, and they come out from their university courses, are selected for their intelligence and their ability, and they get a job, and they try and recreate something similar to what they've had at university. What are my learning outcomes going to be next semester? What are we going to be doing? And they say, what's my roadmap, oh supplier? Please tell me what's going to happen. And effectively, they behave like grown-up children, and expecting their suppliers to behave as the adults. Now, of course, you get a disastrous dynamics if you get a supplier that's used to behaving like a children, acting as a supplier that it's itself acting as a child and expecting to be led. So you have to really be careful, particularly when you're doing big international procurements, to understand the culture of, who are the grown-ups? Where are the grown-ups? Are the grown-ups in the customer? Are the grown-ups in the supplier? And of course, it's not consistent because the US government has a very childish attitude to healthcare. So whereas federal procurement centralizes most of the risk buffer, you get to US healthcare, and it's the opposite, where everybody has to have their little risk buffers of their health insurance companies in state, and that means that more than 50% of the money in the US that's spent on healthcare is actually spent on financing risk buffers, for shareholders, not on delivery of healthcare.
That's what I was kind of referring to when I said to Petra that I thought she was protecting people against the medical system. but you bring up, actually, and I'm going to throw it might be right or wrong in how to think about that particular situation from another angle in terms of an archetype. What do you do with the warrior when there's no war? And I say that because one thing that is so embedded in our culture is negotiating from a win-lose perspective. And in fact, that's why I brought it up, because in contracting, the old models are very much based on cost plus, and what happens is what it turns into is a exploitive no win game, because I'm going to take the lowest bidder, but then all the contractors know that they're going to make their money on
change control normally, yeah.
Change orders, right? And so there, of course, that screws up everything from what the scope of work is, and in addition, what is the responsibility of the buyer? Actually, in construction, commercial construction jobs have actually started shifting and changing their business model. And as we move into the world of platforms, we are going to see a lot of these old models disrupted. And so and hopefully we will these platforms are going to start basically offboarding is a nice way to say it. Those that are bad players, are bad actors. And so we are going to get to the point where we are actually in a co-creative arrangement with our customers and our vendors and our suppliers. So, we're in effect becoming boundaryless in many ways. And in doing that, we're also our roles are becoming boundaryless. And I think that's part of the meaning crisis that we're in today, is because people are trying to fit their identities and their roles into this old war-based mentality, especially in terms of strategy. And so they just can't see a world that's based on omni-win.
So we need to descend the rabbit hole, don't we? We need to enter the world of adventure in some more extreme way to kind of loosen us up cognitively, so we
Absolutely,
can try and make sense of this.
Different roles,
It is really the need for us to collectively go through an adventure together to rebase our definition of winning and losing and those sorts of things, and I guess that's a challenge because it's going to be a majority. It's going to be almost like an innovation curve, isn't it? Some people will go there, and we'll be talking to people in the new year that are into regenerative economies and circular economies and things like that. But the deal is that until we get a critical mass, then that's going to be a challenge. So are there early adopters of archetypes? Are there people who say, I'm going to try this and I'm different, but I'm going to keep going?
Chris, I'd just like to chip in there. Great question, and we must remember your question. I think what we're touching on here, though, is really a problem for the West and for the Northern Hemisphere around individualism, because a lot of the things we're looking for are individualistic archetypes rather than collective ones. And I think more collectivist societies, whether it's the East, whether it's the South, the collectivist societies are far ahead of Western individualistic societies in looking for the kinds of patterns that are, collaborative and strategic, and are not just trying to exploit in some simplistic individualistic way. So
I would cut across there though, Tim, because the danger with an overly collective society is that it's not good at dealing with change. And when you're dealing with, if you look at the studies done on the response to the tsunami in the Tohoku tsunami, when you have the whole culture there was based on the family, and people came running back into the danger zone to check that their family was okay, and therefore died. They all died. There's a case, we were talking earlier on about people following a pattern rigidly, and there was a case of a bunch of school teachers who, although safety was literally just up the hill behind them, they kept all the children in the school so that the parents could find them. And unfortunately, they all died. So you've got to get, the point here is the trade-offs. Now, one of the things I'd go back to Christina about is that we've got layers and intersections of different archetypes, and particularly archetype sets. We talk about, for example, service versus product is another one that we look at. We've got all the Jungian set. We've got the six thinking hats set. You've got the hats as a doctor. Myself as an enterprise architect, I'm dealing constantly from all the hats from strategy to front line and back again. I'm dealing with very large timescales, very short timescales, all at the same time. So I have to switch between them and know that I'm switching between them. You said about
so let me point something out. What you just said is critical here, because, and you may or may not have meant it this way, but I just want to point out that, in effect, you said you have to do that. And one thing that let's point out that actually people have to do that in clusters, and they have to navigate together.
I could be naughty and say that you can be plural as well as singular.
Well, so what I'm working on, and have had some really shocking revelations around, is I truly believe that people have to learn to negotiate. But negotiation is a dirty word. I mean, you want to trigger people? Tell them about negotiating. But yet it is because they are automatically going to that win-lose.
Yeah. And so I'd throw in a comment there about what I talk often about pediarchy, rule by, for, and on behalf of the childish. We've got this, essentially the whole mine. As soon as someone says mine, you're dealing with a 2-year-old.
Mine.
It's mine. Unless I don't want it, in which case it's yours. Or rather, if it's yours, it's mine. But but I will give the ice cream wrapper to mummy. And it's it's always somebody else's problem. We've got anti-property as much as we have property. And it's looking at these things about how all those work, how all those intersect. And I said that the avoidance of work is as much a driver as the going for work. We punish people for being responsible and reward them for being irresponsible.
Well, there's
some problems there.
Well, there's no basis of accountability when your primary face is to protect yourself and put up appearances. But Tom, I'm going to push back on you on the point about people don't want to work. People want to avoid work. So I think that we have to recognize today that our brains are remarkable, energy efficient machines. And yes, we absolutely will instinctively almost find the quickest path to what we want. The fact that that view of that people are lazy and that people don't want to do work it stems from the days of Taylorism. That viewpoint is why we hear excuses why there's 70+% project failures in every different change initiative type there is. M&A, culture change, organizational development, transformation, technology, every single one of them have roughly the same rate of failure. Now, nobody can really tell you whether they actually benchmark outcomes from the beginning or not, but I won't go there. But the point is that if we continue to project that somebody is being lazy, then is that bringing out their better self? Are we not actually assuming that dark archetype? And so therefore the knee-jerk reaction is to let me control them. Let me put more surveillance on them.
Can I pick up a few in the chat?
Sorry?
Say again, Christina.
Can I pick up a few comments in the chat?
Yeah, brilliant. Yes, great.
Did someone else want to keep going here?
Yeah, go for it.
Did you have any response to that, Tom?
I do, but it doesn't need to be here. It's the very quick one is that a lot of what I'm saying about the work being avoided is actually about fear of change, fear of uncertainty. And it's not a negative, it's that the work is being avoided. That's all. But I strongly agree with Christina that we are here for other people and for other people's comments. So I'd love to hear what those are. I agree with you there, Christina.
Yeah. So Thiago wants to re-ask the question. Thiago, if I post the StreamYard link, because you've asked quite a few related questions to Petra, just to clarify, do you want to just, like, if you want, you can nip on, and then we can hear from you directly, and then it will be a bit easier because you posted quite a few things. If you're interested, let me know whether you want to come on. If not, I'll read your comments.
I've reviewed Thiago's comments. And
okay, perfect.
Yeah, I can say that he's asking me how, if I knew where to reach out for specific information, and where was there the context of, like, did I have a network of people who were in that field? Where he's also said that, it was quite funny that he would never go into jewelry, I suppose, because he doesn't know anyone in that field. So it would be really difficult, which is true. It was very much, for me, a dive into the unknown. I did not know anyone inside the field of cybersecurity. Almost no one generally in the field of IT. My whole family has done humanities, sociology, philosophy, and so on. Psychology. So I really didn't, it was more of a dive into the unknown, but this is what was the exciting part for me. I loved that dive into the unknown. The only place I kind of decided to put my anchor in and seek where I can find something was, I did enter a university, so a master's degree in cybersecurity. And I did attend meetups of London Ladies Hacking Society, where I actually found a network through which I actually have my current job in Glasgow, where they actually just pointed towards their job post. So it wasn't really a network of people, it was just people telling me, oh, look, there's a job post there, you should apply. Oh, look, you should look this up. So it's more kind of like them pointing things out rather than, being kind of like a support network or anything else. But that was the exciting bit for me, is the dive into the unknown that kind of even attracted me.
So you answered, yeah. So you answered the call to adventure then.
Yeah, exactly. That was it. That was pretty much it.
So Dave Penville's asking a question of Christina, which is, if archetypes never were but always are, which I think you were going through at the start, Christina, what are the archetypes of the future, and what patterns should we consciously choose?
Yeah, I was just noting some of the other ones that were down there, so I just thought there's three of them. I'll just answer them.
Yeah, perfect.
I think it's very important to bring a systemic perspective to what we're speaking about. So we can't just say the pattern of addiction lies solely with the addict, right? Mm-hmm. We have to be able to look at the family, the culture, the collective trauma that exists. And I think that is so important, to be able to continuously bear that systemic perspective, because otherwise we get into this real dangerous, everything is my responsibility, everything is all on my shoulders, I'm responsible for everything. It's like, did you bring the sun up this morning? Are you doing the Earth gravitational pull at the moment? Are you putting the moon into the sky to work with the tides? So it's really important to be able to broaden that perspective when we look at archetypes. Secondly, there was a question there about what patterns can we look at more broadly than being able to say something like the trickster or the jester. I think chaos is a very good one. And it's really interesting to watch how the trickster works with chaos, where they stand outside of it, but still inform it. And I think it's really important to know, again, there's chaos that births universes, the genesis of all new things, but there's the self-generated sabotorial chaos, which most of us exist in. And I think broader archetypal patterns for us to be able to view at this time are obviously the seasons. How do we move out of a linear growth mindset, right, where we want to, infinite resources on a finite planet, to the death rebirth narrative, even in a financial and economic system, right? Yes. So I think those are archetypally interesting to look at. But I just thought maybe just to ground it a little, and this is there was a comment earlier about corporate tarot readings. And I had to speak at a conference in January on what I felt would be the 4 influential archetypes for 2020. Now, as we know, in January, we really, COVID-19 was only really being spoken about in China. And so I gave the conference in January, and I said the 4 for this year are the Hermit, the Healer, the Trickster, and the Liberator. Now, when the Journal of Future Studies asked me then to write about this, about the synchronicity in March, because we were then experiencing those patterns in the shadow form. So externally imposed isolation, disruptive, destructive health issues, the chaos, the fake news, the tyranny. But we haven't yet been able to move that pattern yet into the light. So honestly, when I thought of the Hermit, I thought it was more about, and thought received, the turning inward is necessary for growth. Like each year has a winter, we need a cocoon stage. So hibernation, solitude, introspection, and reflection. And if you're wanting to know an archetype for the future, one that will always be there with us is the Hermit, because we must know how to take hermitage within ourselves. It's very crucial for expansion, but we're always wanting to fill the silent space with trivial, busy work or worry. So can we go into the treasure that only silence can bring? So that's what I was seeing for the Hermit. If we looked at the Healer, I didn't predict the ramifications health-wise, but for me, I was thinking, why is the Healer going to be dominant in 2020? Because it's not just about illness. To heal means to come whole, to come into balance. How can we bring a healing lens to the many aspects of our lives? And as I said earlier, collective systems that require repair. Can you actually make healing choices? So holistic, interconnected choices that honor not just ourselves, but also our communities and our beloved planet. And just the last 2, just briefly, that I mentioned were the trickster. So this pattern exposes illusion. It unveils our greatest insecurities and teaches us that everything contains its opposite. And I think it was really wonderful hearing Petra speak, because it really showed me how we have to move from either or to both and. And really, paradox is really the trickster's calling card. So it can assist us in breaking down these conventions and undoing structures that we no longer want or need. But can we perceive the trickster as a messenger? And if we can, what's the guidance it offers to our previous blindness? And I think that's the thing with archetypes. How do we actually live into the mystery of the questions rather than the left brain solution? And just the last, because to the question of the archetype for this year or future, is the Liberator. Freedom, hope, courage. Like, we must ask ourselves, what are we being held hostage to? We might look at our brothers and sisters in America and very easily see the patterns of master-slave. But are we a slave to our job? Are we a slave to the mortgage? What systems are we a slave to, right? So we have to look at what is keeping us from rising to our potential. Can we liberate ourselves from fear? And what is the rebellion that is required in the dark hour? And I think this is where we can sometimes call on some of those more, we might call them platonic ideals of truth, beauty, and justice, but we can ground them in social justice, in protecting the beauty of the earth, like truth found through hope and action. And I think that the Liberator is asking to free ourselves and the collective from all forms of oppression. And we could say in the West, it's something from us in our very distracted social media minds, but it can be a very form of systemic oppression in maybe a post-Soviet country. So I just think, sorry, I've gone on and I rambled there, but I'll just stop. Sorry.
That's good. It's good. It's good stuff. I wouldn't mind just talking about the healer a little bit. So something I've done in my organisation that I've spoken to Susan about, and I think Tim knows about as well, is, and I think I might have mentioned it to Tom, is we've been working in what we call guilds. And those are spaces where we can talk about the work, but in a non-transactional way. We can talk about the nature of work and the systems of work, and we can join people together that are part of a community that operates maybe in a formalized way most of the time. And, you know, we exist normally, we have a job role, we might exist in a silo, we might have a role in a particular process or a value chain, and we're able to just dissolve those for the time of the guild meeting, which might be, say, an hour a week. And that's pretty interesting, because so we've been running these for just over a couple of years now, and what we find is we get, in some respects, with a small h, we get kind of healing dynamics, because we get to hear what it's like, rather than can you deploy my application to Google Cloud Platform, and why haven't you done it in time? We can actually talk about, well, let's talk about cloud, or what does it mean to you? What do you think it means? How do you think you could get value out of it? Oh, I disagree. Well, why is that? Well, I'm looking at it from this perspective. And what we're doing is we're actually exploring what these things, now they're not necessarily archetypes in the way that the Jungian archetypes are, but we're still exploring these unique perspectives and then trying to build them together into a system, and then looking at it from different sorts of perspectives. So, but very, very much we are we're working against the existing constraints of the system by dialogue, and we're really, you know, opening up the opportunity for further growth and renewal as a result.
So I want to say that I interviewed Chris actually on a show recently, on your show, Chris. And you know, Chris actually acts as an alchemist, and that came through, I felt like, in the interview. But it also cuts through those the silos, and that's what I was fascinated with in terms of that. And so the guilds, you know, you've got the journeyman, you've got a number of archetypes that really do, you know, it is more about a craft.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it goes to the point that Tom made about archetype sets. What we're doing is we're saying the sets of possibilities are greater than the current organizational structure, but we have to actually explore those mentally. We have to, almost in a hermitage in a way, we're drawing ourselves out like hermits from the everyday, and then exploring our different perspectives, and then creating something new as a result, in the best case.
Perhaps throw in an idea here. A long time ago, I started trying to reclaim the word weird, because the weird is actually the Nordic version of the Three Sisters of Fate. That in the classic Greek version, you've got Clotho, Lachesis, Atropos. Clotho is the one from whom we get the word cloth. But they weave a fabric of lives. One spins, one weaves, one cuts. And that is an individual life that is placed into the fabric. There is a cross-warp of chance, but the lives are essentially separate. It's a very individualistic model. But in the Nordic version, there's three sisters, exactly the same Indo-European myth. But instead of a fabric of lives, it's a fabric of life. And it's like a Celtic knotwork. It weaves through itself. So a life consists of a choice of paths, pathways going through the weird. And
now, when you say
the weird,
spell that for me.
Okay, in English, it's usually spelled as W-E-I-R-D. In the original version, it's actually U-R-F-H, and it comes out in two different versions. One of them is the word weird, the other is the word earth. They're the same thing. In German, Erde is the same. It's the same set. And so you get But you've got Earth, Vathanthi, and Skulls. They are the three sisters. So the word weird is actually a person's name.
Okay.
But it's like a weaving through. And the point we've got is there's always a choice, but there's always a twist.
Yeah.
We weave through it. So it's a collective at the same time as an individual. It's an individual path. And that's why I come back to that thing about the tarot. Your idea of business tarot was actually a very good one, because rather like the classic biblical texts and so on, they're just collections of perspectives. And the Greek, the gods in the classic models are basically just archetypes. If you overdo an archetype, it's always got its negative side. We see this so often with the archetype of the mother, the archetype of the warrior, all of those ones. So this idea of there's always a choice, but there's always a twist can be a very useful one here. And often we see the word weird in that sense spelled W-Y-R-D as a way of making it to stand out as a distinction. But it's a useful one to look at because we then have choices how we do it. But to do it, we need situational awareness, which is where we come straight back to Petra's point about understanding of what's going on, that we're making a choice. Petra, that you were saying about situational awareness. How do you choose a perspective? That would be one I'd pass over to you, perhaps.
How do you choose perspective?
How do you choose the hat?
I guess it depends what I guess it depends what function you need to perform in a given moment. I can give a medical example. Like, as a doctor, I could, in a cardiac arrest situation, I could, I can give heart massage, so perform the actual CPR, or I can be the team leader who's actually leading the whole team. If I'm the one performing cardiac massage, I won't, the chest compressions, I won't have much situational awareness in that moment, and I'll be just focused on one task. But if I'm the team leader, I will have to have the situational awareness of being aware of every single task that's being performed and every single outcome and every single result that we're getting from the whole situation. So I guess we choose that depending on what function we're performing in that given moment. And that can be very interchangeable, because if the person who's doing the chest compressions gets tired, they will have to perform another function. And the team leader is the one who's going to choose it for them in that particular situation. So I guess that can be an example of how do we choose our perspectives, which we can be the same person, but in that given moment we have to perform a certain function. So that's how we approach it.
I'd like to pick up there on both on the cyber angle, and also something that was talked that Susan mentioned earlier about transparency. So on the one hand, I think that we're living in an era where there's more access to information about what's happening in other parts of the world, and so there is that kind of transparency. But at the same time, we have kind of new forms of deception, and not just fake news, but potentially artificial intelligence, deep fakes. And it's interesting that in philosophy, like Jean Baudrillard in the 1960s, came up with the idea of the simulacrum. So where people actually treat the replica of something as the real. And so I think what we're trying to do in this conversation is to explain that replicas and simulations can have a very useful role to play in guiding you to the truth, but you always have to be clear in your mind about the difference between working with a simulation or a representation and the underlying reality. And particularly with cyber, we often use representations to explain to people what are going on, but we're very conscious that we can't see or touch the digital world. We have to use technology to access the technology, and therefore we're kind of always a few steps removed away from our own direct experience, and it takes a lot of I suppose, a lot of layers of awareness to be able to keep in mind both the representation and the underlying reality. And more people are going to need these type of skills as we go forward, because more and more people are having their experience of reality mediated by technology, and they're finding it difficult to know what's real and what's an inaccurate representation.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, it's actually what came back to.
Point. And so I'm going to have to bow out here, guys. But I will be most interested in listening to the finale. So this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for Chris for having me, and it's great to see you again, Tom, and wonderful to meet you, Tim, and Petra, and Christina. And I'm going to run. So enjoy.
Thanks, Susan.
Okay.
So I wouldn't mind just bringing in another set of archetypes that are related to the work of Simon Wardley. So Simon Wardley does lots of interesting work, including an article that he wrote around pioneers, settlers, and town planners. And as somebody who works in the IT space, and I'm interested in the innovation process, I see this dynamic a lot. So the idea is that pioneers, like, there's the risk and uncertainty, and they live by their wits. The town planners are trying to make things efficient and scalable and safe, and then the settlers are trying to move things that have been innovated through that innovation curve until they're things that have been tamed and have utility. And those, I guess, are an archetypal set. And indeed, Simon Wardley says, pioneers are great people, they can do all these things. Settlers are great people, they can do all these things. Town planners are great people, they can do all these things. In organizations, we often find that we don't get an even balance of these types of individuals. I don't know if that's anybody else's experience also, but we don't necessarily get the whole set expressed in terms of the types of organizations that we have.
Very much so. One of the models I use is about people working in context, working in scope, of sort of the purpose people, the people, the preparation people, the process people, and the performance people. And when any one of those dominates an organization, you get some really well-known ghastly mistakes. For example, if the purpose people dominate, which I've seen in a scientific research lab, everyone is an idea hamster. Nothing actually gets started, let alone finished. Then you've got the people who are all busy trying to make everything perfect, arguing about the scope, stabbing each other in the back. And again, nothing ever actually gets started because everyone's disagreeing. You've got the preparation people who are really well known. It's called analysis paralysis. You never actually get things started. Then you've got the production people who never want to stop. They never want to change anything. It's produce. And then you've got the performance people, where you have the whole culture based on it's your fault. So we've all seen organizations like that. And that's what happens when one organization, one perspective, one of those five archetypes dominates an organization. So there's another one required, which is about, so you've got a leadership in each one of those. But you've also got a leadership, and you mentioned Janus earlier on, Chris. You've got a leadership that moves from one to the next. And you have to have that. Now, the danger is that you're a traitor to both of them.
Yeah, and this is.
And you've then got to have, so just to finish, you've got one of those that has to bridge between each one of them, but you've also got to have one in the middle who keeps the balance.
Yeah, and
that set is really important.
And this bridging is something. So I read the Wikipedia article and on Janus, and I was very interested to know, first of all, that people used to anoint newlyweds or brides used to anoint their door hinges with wolf fat as a way of appeasing Janus, which I thought was maybe that's what we're doing wrong with our transformation. We don't have enough wolf fat, but I didn't think wolves had any fat, so I'm a bit confused about this. You know, I wouldn't really want to go and get some either, but the
wolf might have an opinion on it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. But the idea is that often in transformation I have to look in two directions at once, and that is a cognitive load that is often hard, and I also need to be understood by both groups. So often I see this a lot in cloud computing, where the pioneers and the town planners, there's too much distance between them, and actually straddling that, which is often the role of the settler who are in a mediation position, they can sometimes have difficulty being able to articulate the importance of what they're doing, because the pioneers are basically, they're sexy, they're doing the cool sexy stuff. The town planners are doing the big important heavy duty stuff, but who's actually moving between the two? That it's a hard thing to be able to articulate. So I suppose one thing I'd be interested in people's perspectives. Are some archetypes missing because they're more obscure and harder to actually articulate?
Well, they're just going to throw in there, because in the settler mode in Simon Wardley, it maps exactly to the position of the chasm in that classic description about crossing the chasm. So one of the reasons it's missing is because it's embarrassing. That it's also the place where you go through into the dealing with the reality as opposed to the grand ideas, or no one wants to do the work of actually making things work. But the other one is that if you look for some of the archetypes, they would be the bridge, the translator, the arbitrator. All of those are, or the referee is another one. The referee is the one, but when we look at the difference between finite and infinite games, an individual game is often perceived as a battle, but the referee's job is to make it sure it conforms to the agreements of the infinite game. That's what a judge does, is it says we are dealing with the reality. Another one, Petra, particularly from your environment, is the difference between Occam's razor and Hickham's dictum. Hickham's dictum is in medicine, patients can have as many diseases as they damn well pleases. That you don't get this kind of everything reduced down to the simplistic. We're always dealing with the uncertainty as well as the certainty. So it's the archetypes we're looking for, that looking at the bridges between the other kind of chaos, like you were mentioning, Christina, about the void, about the realm of possibility. So that's some examples. So the translator, the bridge, the arbitrator, the referee, there's the judge is another one. There's some useful ones here.
I think there's a role here for a communicator as well, isn't there? I mean, the poet, the storyteller, because effectively we're collectively telling a story with different voices, but it's different threads of the same story. And it reminds me actually of I was a year late starting Latin because I have a change of school when I was young, and I was stuck. My very first Latin sentence was poetae fabulam narrant, which when you break it down was many poets, poetae plural, fabulam single story, narrant, and that's the multiple poets. So many poets telling, the poets are telling a single story. So effectively, the thing that we're missing in a lot of education is getting people to collectively tell a single story, allowing respect for all of the different voices to be part of that story, and really education by subject and education by discipline doesn't develop a generalist ability to tell stories collectively.
Yeah. Another example would be the university, which isn't. It's not a university at all. It's a multiversity. It's dealing with the separation of things more often than the unification of them. I'm going to sing some praises of a couple of women, Sue Clifford and Angela King, with a group called Common Ground in the UK, who do things like parish maps. They get people to build a map of how they see their own locale. They often get it with, for example, I mean, there's one that was built by a black community in Bristol on the inside of a double-decker bus. A lot of them have done them as embroideries or tapestries. They are sort of a statement of the story of place. And the vision, an organizational vision, by which I don't just mean the goals of our current strategy, but the role of a vision in an organization is an anchor in that same sense. We are all together telling a shared story. That's what an enterprise is, as opposed to an organization. The enterprise is the why, where the organization is the how. Those things are quite useful to look at.
And to Tim's point there about the poets, I think it's you can't enter the realm of the collective unconscious through the left brain linear mind. We need to go through myths, we need to go through symbols, we need to go through dreams. Poetry is the closest in language we can to articulate it, but we have lost this poetic imagination and poetic and metaphorical, we don't teach metaphor in schools hardly anymore, etc., to be able to easily enter this realm, so it becomes our default realm. And just a bit like Tom, how you just mentioned the word tapestry, I think one of the archetypes that we need of the future/now or ancient, future ancient is the weaver. And so it's a bit like Penelope in the Odyssey about the unweaving is actually a forward motion.
The unweaving, notice, as well as the weaving.
Yeah, which is beautiful. And I think just the last to Chris's point is also how he said about the wolf bat. In transformation, you always need rituals.
Yeah.
And we're sorely lacking rituals and a ritualized life to be able to enable the threshold crossing that is being asked of us at this moment in time.
And we've got about 4 minutes to go, so it'd be interesting to just see how we can kind of wind up this fascinating discussion. I'm just going to post the Slack link just in case people want to join up our Slack and get involved in future shows. So I'll do that now while I remember, because I forgot last week. Wow, there's a lot to take in. I think that the main thing I get concerned about is that it feels like there's all of these wonderful possibilities that are somehow lacking from our everyday narrative and dialogues. It feels like there's almost, to use a kind of, again, a new term on me, but it's almost there's a hypocognition problem that we don't actually, these things are really important, very important to transformation, but we don't, we just don't have we have the language, but we don't have as much of a share of collective literacy around these sorts of things. So it seems like it's does that mean that we is it because we become too left-brained? Do we need to be promoting the arts more in schools or companies? Do we need to be putting on company plays?
I actually said that to a colleague recently, that she would only understand her business model if she could dance it. They're talking about the embodiments. You're saying about going into the symbols. One of the things here is also how we embody it, how we use not just the mental perspective, but also the physical perspective, the spiritual perspective as well. But the physicality is important too, and I think we miss that.
I mean, psyche and soma are interlinked. I think that we can even say there's the trend for somatic leadership at the moment, right? Not that it's a trend or anything, but I think we really have to recognize how cosmos, psyche, and soma are all interlinked.
Yeah, Chris, you were saying, sorry. I agree, Christina, very strongly.
Yeah. I mean, brilliant. I mean, these Dave Pendle posted the comment of, let me see, the world is in a dynamic of unweaving. So yeah, I would agree with that. We've got certain things. I've heard people who are talking about capitalism doesn't seem to be working anymore, and these are capitalists saying that. And so there's all these sorts of things that are occurring in our world where does the myth, do these myths and these archetypal figures, do they rise up in times of crisis? Are we talking about them more because they never went away? But they're maybe the harbingers of, they're the people that are going to get us through and over to the other side, through that, into that world of adventure and back out into some future, collective future.
Sorry, just going to respond very quickly to a comment Dave Pendle's just made about bringing the dynamic, non-denominational exploration of spirit. The definition of spiritual that I use is a sense of meaning and purpose, a sense of self and of relationship with that which is greater than self. And I think that's directly applicable to all of the discussion we've had here. That an archetype is self, but also a relationship with that which is greater than self.
And Petra, did you want to have some closing words, and then Tim and Christina?
I just want to add, I felt it was really powerful how we talked about the multiple hats, that we can use, and how they can all be present in, they can represent certain archetypes, but they can all be present in one archetype. And I felt like it was super powerful how Christina mentioned, like, it can be both archetypes at the same time. And yeah, that's kind of my closure, that I feel like we should all keep in mind depending on our certain situation and function, to call those archetypes from us and use them for our advantage and the advantage of others, of course.
Tim?
I think my main reflection from this discussion is that we all need to play a part in suppose, mentoring and educating, encouraging people to use archetypes and metaphor in a more fearless way, in a more overt way, in almost all areas of life, because the world is becoming more complex. It's becoming more risky, difficult to deal with, and more people need to have the ability to cope with the greater complexity, the greater change, and we're better to help coach people and mentor them than to anchor them in very ancient stories that go back thousands of years and have been served the needs of previous civilizations. So I really think that this theme is one that should be taken forward and should be encouraged in, maybe not in formal educational context, but in kind of social education and in our practice as advisors to organizations, that we need to encourage this.
And Christina, did you want to have the final word?
That we also need to work and be in alignment with the archetypes of nature and the cosmos too.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a brilliant place to finish up. So that's all we have time for today. So I'd like to thank Susan, who had to leave early, Petra, Tom, particularly Tom, because it's only just past dawn, I think, where he lived, Tim, and Christina. So it just and I'd like to thank, obviously, the people who've sorry, did I not? What was that, Tim? Did I not thank Petra?
I think you said Christina twice instead of Petra, but
Petra, apologies. And thank you very much for the people who've been staying with us and asking us questions. And we really appreciate it. Really, thank you again for to StreamYard for such a great platform. So that's all we have for this week's episode. Next week is radical emptiness, and we're just trying to work out how we can spend 90 minutes on talking about emptiness. But I'm sure we'll have a.
We will fill it. We will fill it.
Yeah, we will. I think we will. So that's all we have time for. So I've been your host, Chris Patton. Thank you. Good night.